Shalom Aleichem. It is still Monday evening by Red Bench Licht, so it's the 5th Lichtele. I recorded the previous class before Mincha, and now it's night, which gets in the Licht. We already sat by the candles for half an hour, we did all the good stuff, and I'm going to start recording another class. I'm not yet sure how I want to teach this. I suspect that this class will be not till the end of the Mamer, but it'll be long, and then the last class will be much shorter, As I mentioned to you in all the previous classes, this year is tough. Today is Monday, Chof Ches Kislev, tomorrow is Chof Tes Kislev, Tov Shin Pei Daled, and we're learning the Mamer from 60 years ago, from Tov Shin Chof Daled. In that Mamer, the Rebbe is discussing the idea of למטה תכלית, that godliness is found everywhere. And the first half of the Mamer explains that godliness is found everywhere, even in Klipa, and even in the lowest madregas of Klipas, even in the Klipas that are, so to speak, bidei Yodam, which are lower than the Klipas that are bidei Shamayim. There's Elokus there as well, because otherwise it would not be able to exist. The second big idea, which is what we're going to be beginning now in Perek Vav, according to the Hanachas Balahak, the Teres Benachem Hanacha, on page Kuv Vav, is that in Kadosh Kahavaya, although Eid Ein Seif is found everywhere, the way Eid Ein Seif is found in relationship with the Olamais is that it never changes. Ein Mishtana, never changes. Now, I want to give an introduction before I start to learn. I want to start with this. There's a concept in Chassidus based on the Zohar. As we say in the davening every single day in Kaveh, Ein Kadosh Kadeshem, Ke'ein Baltecha, Ve'ein Tzorka Lekeinu. This is a post from the beginning of Sefer Shmuel. It's a part of Chana's praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu after the birth of Shmuel in the very beginning of Sefer Shmuel Aleph. And there's a Zohar on this. Ein Kadosh Kahavaya, there's nobody holy like Shem Hashem. So the Zohar says, Kama Kaddish and Inun. There are various different things that are called holy. But Ein Kadosh Kahavaya, nobody is holy like Havaya is holy. That's what it says in the Zohar. I remember the first time I came across it was in Hemshech Samach Vov, and I went to look. I found actually a Mamer from the Alter Rebbe, I think from Tavkuf Samach A, which actually begins with the Dibra Maschel Ein Kadosh Kahavaya. A short little Mamer where he gives a mashal from Das to explain what it means in Kadosh Kahavaya. Ein Kadosh Kahavaya is an interesting concept. The beginning of the concept is defining that over here Havaya means Mamala Kalam. It doesn't mean the Havaya of Sebev Kalam, it doesn't mean Havaya of Lifnei Atzimtzum. It certainly doesn't mean Havaya of Atzmos or Shema Etzem. It means Havaya which is Behegili and Elamis. The lowest Madreg of Shema Havaya, in other words. Not the lowest. The lowest Madreg of Shema Havaya is Havaya Lashon Mahava. It's Havaya Lashon Hoy Hoy Havaya which is Evid Ein Seif. Ein Seif. But Ein Seif which is a Madreg of Gili and even Islapshus. So the Pasuk says, Ein Kadosh Kavaya, nobody is holy like Kavaya is holy. So the Zohar says, Kama Kaddish and Inun, there's various different things that are holy. Ve'ein Leis Kadosh Kavaya, nothing is holy like Shem Havaya is holy. But the meaning of these words is that we know from all over Chassidus that the word Kedusha means Havdalah. Holy means removed, separated. More precisely, holy means removed in a categoric way. In other words, not just the two things are separated because you physically separated them, but two things are separated because they have absolutely no relationship whatsoever in an absolute way. Like, for example, you wouldn't call oil and water holy because the oil hovers, because they have a relationship. Fire is called holy because fire is categorically moved from the other three elements of gas and liquid and solid. The mashal for holiness is fire, light. So holiness is something which is categorically removed. In other words, for something to be pure, they're a part of the world, they're just a good part of the world. For something to be holy, they have to really be held from the top. It's a whole different kind of an idea, which categorically removed because it comes from heaven. So that's what the word Kedusha means. So the Zohar says, Kama Kaddish, many things are holy. But as a rule, when you define something as holy, its holiness is based on the fact that it's removed. Hashem is holy in his relationship with the world because it's removed from the world. Whereas you find in the Maimorim, Hashem has to lower himself to be above the world. Hashem by himself is not even holy. That's what it says in some of the Maimorim. Hashem has to lower himself to be above the world in a way that makes him holy. But the idea that Hashem lowers himself to be above the world in order to be holy makes sense, because even in his, so to speak, coming in proximity to the world, he's Kedusha, he's completely removed. The same would also apply to Ein Seif. When you're talking about Atzilus of Ein Seif, or the Madrege of Ein Seif, which we classically call Helam, Seif of Kalalman, that's Kedusha, but that Kedusha makes sense. It's holy because its nature is that it's separated from the world. One of the criteria of Igulim, of Seif of Kalalman, is, it's not that it's not revealed in vessels, it's that it cannot be revealed in vessels. Seif of Kalalman either destroys vessels or passes through them and doesn't even touch them, because it's not developed sufficiently to interface with a keli on a level where you could speak about Gili. So when you're speaking about Kvayachal Elakus, on the Madreg of Atzmus, Madreg of Igulim, Seviv, and you say Kedusha, Kedusha means it's holy in its relationship with the world because it has nothing to do with the world. And that's what the Zayed is saying. Kama, Kaddish, and there are various things that are holy, but as a rule, holiness is defined by things that are removed from the world. But Leis Kedusha Havaya, nothing is holy like Shem Havaya, because Havaya here means Memalakalam. It means the level of godliness, the idea of godliness, that's proximate, that comes into the world, that's revealed in the world, that goes into the Keli. And to use classic language of Hasidus, takes on the Gava, takes on the color of the Kli and the character of the Keli, at least in as much as Gilui is concerned. And that's why it's a novelty. Other things are holy because they have no relationship with Elames. Havaya is holy even though it has a relationship with Elames, and therefore it's unique. Ein Kodesh Havaya, it's involved in the world, it's engaged with the world, and nevertheless it's Mamer D'Matzav as a Mamer D'Matzav of Kedusha. That's the pshat in the Zohar. Now, in Chassidus, there's a variety of mishalim that are used to describe the meeting between Ein Seif and Kelim and Atzilus. There's a variety of different mishalim. One of the mishalim, which is going to be brought in our Mamer, on page Kuf Yud, is the mashal of Mayan Bekli Meguven, or Bekli Meguven, water in a colored glass, or light in a colored glass. But if you put water into a colored glass and you look at the glass from the outside, the water seems to be a particular color and the water is still clear. And Chassidus uses both the mashal of water and the mashal of light. That not only when water is in a colored glass, that although on the outside the water seems colored, it's still clear, the same is also true of light. That when light, sunlight, shines through a colored glass, and it comes out the opposite side, seeing blue or red or green, the Maimon is going to give 3 colors: red and yellow or green and white, which are representative of Chagas. So the light comes through the glass in a different color. We say that although it seems to us, to the Makabel, to us, the light is of a different shade, of a different color, the light has not changed. It's still the same light. Now, it's very important to appreciate that this mashal, the way Chassid, it's brought from the Pardes. It's brought in Chassidus from the Pardes. And this mashal is not true in physics. On a physical level, this mashal is not true. How you would apply this mashal to physics, I have some very, very vague ideas about how to explain it, how to represent it, but not anything I'm comfortable sharing. I have other ideas which will in general address the whole question of the mashal of physical light and Ein Seif, the light of the sun and Ein Seif, which is a discussion for a different time. Somebody once asked me about it in a Q&A, and I answered them privately, and then I wanted to find the question to do it in public, and I wasn't able to find it, and I saw it as Ashkocha Prata. So if you want to ask me about it, go ahead, and I'll try to record something on it. But simply speaking, this mashal, that when light goes through a colored glass, and it comes at the other side, and Chassidus is arguing that the meaning of Ein Kodesh Kavaya would say that even the light, although what you're seeing is the color red, or the color blue, or the color green, or the color yellow, or the color purple, or the color orange, whatever color it is, the light is really the same, just perception is different, isn't physically true. Because in physics, when light hits a glass of a particular color, what's actually happening is the color in the glass is absorbing all of the wavelengths except for the one wavelength that shines through. In other words, when you see a glass that's green, actually it's everything but green. So it absorbs all the wavelengths of light that it has within the glass, and the color that it does not have within its spectrum comes out. That's where you see the green on the opposite side. Which is why if you shine light through a clear glass and you shine light through, let's say, a red glass or a blue glass, there'll be more heat in the colored glass than in the clear glass, because the clear glass is not absorbing any of the light. Whereas in the colored glass, the glass is actually holding some of the light back, and that light is changed into heat, and the glass will therefore get hotter. It's simple common sense. And I wonder, I guess blue has a higher frequency. Blue is a shorter wavelength and red is a longer wavelength, so perhaps a blue glass would get hotter than a red glass, but I don't know. I don't know the physics at all. But this is certainly a fact, that when light shines through a colored glass, only the wavelength that you see is being allowed through, the rest of it absorbed by the glass, which means the light is changed. But in the Nimshal Amailo, and again, according to Hasidus, it's true also in the Mashal. According to Hasidus, the physics is this way, and how that can be explained based on how we understand physics at the moment. Again, I have some ideas, but I'm not going to go into it. I don't know. But the way Hasidus understands it is that when light comes through a glass and it takes on the color of that glass, and you therefore observe a particular color, the change is only your observation. But in reality, the entire light that went into the glass is coming through the glass, because light fundamentally remains unchanged. The reason why, when light shines through a colored glass, although you're seeing green, actually it's the same light that was before, but for whatever reason, the light has been modified to your observation to seem green, but it's actually the same, has to do with the qualitative nature of light, which is that it's coming from the source. And because it comes from the source, and the source is such a deep idea, what emerges from the source cannot be changed by its environment. That's how this Mamer is going to explain this physical idea. So first of all, there's a difference between how we understand it physically and how the Mamer is going to explain it. Physically, we understand that light shines through a glass, the light's changed, and the light that comes through the glass is less than the entire spectrum, than the white light. According to Hasidus, according to the Kabbalah, the Pardis, the light is exactly the same. The only difference is our perception, but the light includes every spectra, every wavelength, every color in a singularity of what we call white light. After it goes through the glass, as it did before, except that we don't perceive it. And the reason is because since the nature of the source is so far removed from physical things, the physical world is not only unable to change the source, the physical world is unable to change the light, which is a reflection of that source. That's the mashal. And there's two parts. Number one, that when light shines through a colored glass and it appears colored to us, it's really not colored, the same as it was before. And number two, the reason. Because the nature of the sun is so far removed from other physical things that physical things have no ability to alter it. That's going to be the mashal. And the nimshal, and this is what's important, is Ein Sof. Ein Sof interfaces with the world, particularly Havaya, which means B'malek Halaman, the lowest level of godliness, which is designed to actually go into a keli and be revealed by the keli and interface with the world. And the argument of the Mamer is that Ein Sof, even when it goes into the keli, even when it's revealed through a keli, even when it comes into the worlds, remains exactly what it was prior to its coming into the world. It's unchanged. And you would have to say that its lack of change means it was Ein Sof and Pashut before, it's Ein Sof and Pashut after. And perhaps even more, not only is it Ein Sof and Pashut, it's not even really Gilui. It remains atzmiistic. It remains what light is, existing in relationship with itself as it did before it entered into the world. And that's the first point. And the second point is because the nature of the source. Since the source, which is Hashem, which is God, is categorically removed from anything worldly, the world cannot change him. And not only can the world not change him, the world cannot change his reflection, cannot change his oyer. And that's what we're going to be discussing here in Perek Vav, and in Perek Zayin is a beautiful Avoda, and in Perek Ches. of this Mamer. In the 6 pages approximately, this idea that even though it didn't say from them to Lamata, Mata, the tachlis, godliness is found even in the lowest of the low klippos, because otherwise they would not exist. And faket, as the Rebbe said in the end of the previous shir, it's Hashem made it she'el vayol, and it's worth to be made it she'el for the sake of the vayol. You need to say Aliyah, as we discussed at the end of the previous class. But an Safe's relationship with the world is that it touches the world and the world touches it. It changes the world and the world doesn't change it at all. It remains exactly what it was because of its proximity, because it's a reflection of Etzem. And very soon I'm going to have to interrupt again with a second introduction about the so-called Drush Gimel Shitas of the Tzemach Tzedek, as you'll see in the next paragraph. But let's begin to read with this initial Hagdama. And the Rebbe continues in the Perek Yudalad of his Mamer from Tafshin Yud. And these are words verbatim from the previous Rebbe's Mamer. This entire paragraph is verbatim quote from the previous Rebbe's Perek. To be honest, if I was making this Hanocha, I would have added several more lines. This is word for word from the previous Rebbe's Mamer. I would have added several more lines to account for what's going to be quoted very intermittently, very interrupted in Perek Ches, just like he did in Perek Beis. And if you notice, Perek Beis was a short little Perek unto itself. Perek Beis was just the quote from the Friedrich Rebbe, and then Perek Gimel was the start of the new Perek. So if you want to be uniform, so I would have made Perek Vav a couple of lines longer. I would have several more lines from the Friedrich Rebbe's Mamer, and then I would have started the next paragraph Inyan Bazeh with Perek Zayin. And otherwise, I would have pushed everything off by one number, just for the purposes of uniformity. I mean, based on their own decision to make Perek Beis just the quote, so then I would have made Perek Vav the quote also. There's an inconsistency here, but the Shkiyas mi Yavin, and who am I to talk? But the next whole paragraph is a direct quote from the Friedrich Rebbe. I would have added 2 more lines about the idea in Mitzrayim and in Kodesh Kavai. And the Friedrich Rebbe continues, the reason why godness is found everywhere, even in the lowest klippos, even the klippos that Rebbe the Adam is since ain't safe is ain't safe. And the nature of its ain't safe is in relationship itself. It's an absolute concept of having no limits. Al kain ain't safe gamken lis pashtu, say therefore his presence is everywhere. And all the various steps and all the chain reactional points in the creational chain, ad lamata mamish v'chulu, to the lowest world. So it's not only because, like the Rebbe said in Perek Hey, if the Eibishter's Eid Ein Seif was not in the lowest worlds, the lowest worlds wouldn't have existed, which is an obvious point, right? If Eid Ein Seif does not come into Klippa, there's no Klippa because everything is from the Eibishter. But there's another point. And the second point is that it's Ein Seif b'yetzim. It can't be contained. So there are 2 different reasons why Ein Seif is found Lamata Mata Din Tachlis. Number 1, because otherwise they wouldn't be the Lamata Mata. And number 2, because of the nature of the Ein Seif b'etzim. In every place that it's drawn and it radiates. It doesn't react, it's not affected inversely by its environment. And certainly it's not changed klal whatsoever. So you have 2 Hebrew words, the word hispoilus and the word hishtanus. Hispoilus means reaction and hishtanus means modification and change. Later on, there's going to be a 3rd word, which is the word hisarvus, and that's going to be in Perek Ches, beli hisarvus. 3 words. Beli hispoilus, without being affected inversely by the creation. Beli hishtanus, without being changed by the creation. And beli hisarvus, without becoming interwoven in the creation. So let's translate each of these 2 words separately. The meaning of hispael means a reaction. Hispoilus means a reaction. Something happens and you react. You push a table, so the table moves. Your act is physically moving the table. The movement of the table is a reaction to your physical force, assuming that your physical hands and body are heavier and stronger than the weight and the strength of the grip of the table, legs of the table on the ground in front of you. If the table weighs 2 tons and you push the table, instead of you moving the table forward, the table is going to move you backwards. And in both cases, there's a pu'ula and there's a nifal. The act is pushing against the table, and the nifal, the effect, is what happens. The net difference of physical force either moves the table forward or you backwards. And if there's an exact equilibrium between your physical force and weight as you push against the table. And the weight of the table, you'll remain where you are, and the table will remain where you are, and your hand will get very hot, and the place against the table your hands are touching will equally get very hot, because that's where the energy goes, and they cancel each other out. So this nifal means a reaction. Something happens and you react. That's a hispa'el. You see something happening in the world and it makes you very happy, it makes you very sad, it makes you very excited, it makes you very confident, it makes you very afraid. Those are reactions. And we learn in Chumash that Hashem interfaces with the world. And it seems that his interfacing with the world involves all kinds of reactions. Things happen, the Abish gets angry. Things happen, the Abish gets happy. Things happen, the Abish gets regretful, and all kinds of other psychologically reactionary responses are described anthropomorphically klape shmaya, but they're hakel mashlam litz. It's all allegory. He acts that way, but there's no reaction in godliness. You cannot move God. I don't mean move physically. I mean move spiritually, emotionally. Nothing you do is going to change him. That's the nature of his being, and that's the nature of his relationship with us. It doesn't make him dispersonal, doesn't make him cold, doesn't make him indifferent, it makes him God. There's nothing that we could do that's going to get him to move. Even if the Torah describes him as being emotionally moved, it means he's acting in his relationship with us in the kind of way that we perceive it as an emotional reaction, which is the source of a physical response, so we define him as being emotionally reactionary, responsive. But there's no spoilers. Hashem doesn't react to us. Nothing we do makes him respond. We can't make him happy, we can't make him sad, we can't make him feel good, we can't make him feel bad, we can't touch him. There's no hispa'el. Nothing happens in the Eibishter which is a response to what's happening in the world. And here we're saying, not only there's no hispa'el in the lakad, there's no hispa'el in the lakus. Not only does God not respond, react to the world, even godliness does. And even the godliness of Atzilus. It in Sefer goes into the kלים of Atzilus, which reveals itself to the world and has a relationship with the world. Because of Atzilus, we can touch Ein Seif. Because of Atzilus, Ein Seif can touch us. And all those incredibly important ideas that we speak about when we talk about the Kavonis, the Pri-Eitz Chaim rather than the Eitz Chaim, about how important Atzilus is in allowing it to be a conduit, a channel, a pipe, a tzinit, a mesila, a derech, through which there's a relationship between what's lower than the Elikus and Elikus and what's higher than Gili Elikus, higher than Atzilus. None of it is cause and effect. None of it is pu'ula nifal. None of it is reactionary. Hashem sets it up that it should appear that way, but we do not have the ability to affect in him a hispoilus. Nothing we do gets him to react. Nothing we do gets himliness to react. Nothing we do gets himliness to react, even as Hashemliness, as a lakus, is b'eslapchus and kלים of Atzilus. The meaning of hispoilus. And of course, ishtanos means change. Now, to a very great extent, these two words are synonyms. A reaction is a change. But change is a more profound word than the word reaction, because reactions can be temporary. A change connotes something far more permanent. So we use both of these words. Godliness comes into Atzilus. And the meaning of godliness coming into Atzilus is that it's revealed in Atzilus to have a relationship with the lower worlds, and through our kavonis and our yichudim we could reach up to Atzilus, all the stuff that you learn about in Kabbalah and in kavonis, that the l'shem yichud kutsha brichu shchinte, that our davening and our mitzvahs and our teidah can have an effect in the higher worlds, and how the higher worlds then trickle down to the lower world. You should know there's no hispoilus and there's no china. You haven't moved Atzilus and you haven't changed Atzilus. Yeah, but what about the fact that we learn about all these changes and adaptations and reactions, actions and reactions? It's all b'li hispoilus. It's all b'li shinui. So if it's b'li hispoilus and b'li shinui, why is there hispoilus and why is there a shinui? So on the bottom of page Kov Zayin, the Rebbe is going to call it ke'echa kel yochel. That it doesn't happen logically. It doesn't happen because we're moving him. It doesn't happen because we're changing him, because he can do whatever he wants, and this is what he wants to do. I'm going to get to this more later on. But I think it's important to properly understand these two words. Elikus does not respond, not only Hashem, but Hashemliness. Elikus does not respond to the world. Nothing we do really changes him. And certainly it doesn't change him and godliness in a more permanent way. So although, even though godliness is found everywhere, even in למטה, which is even lower than klipas, as the Abish created them, There is no reaction, there's no change at all. And he says, you cannot compare it to the relation between the soul and the body. The soul does respond to what happens in the body. When the body hurts itself, the neshama hurts. When the body burns itself, the neshama burns. When the body is cold, the neshama is cold. When the body is happy, the neshama is happy. There's interrelationship. And you'll see this mention of the neshama is going to come back up again on page Kuf Yud. Now the Haskalah Shebet Dover, obviously this is what the Eibishter wants. But you have a Atzilus, a sugya that the neshama is called a pnimi b'yetz. Even though the neshama is a replica of Ein Sof, right? The neshama has 5 levels. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida, and a Nitutz Beiri, which is called Yochid, because that's how many Madrigas Nalakus there are. But the nature of the neshama is that when it touches a body, it becomes singularly dedicated and loyal to that body. In other words, godliness is always godliness, and its loyalty is to God. It interfaces with the world and always remains loyal to its source. The soul is a creation, of godliness, but when it relates to the body, its loyalty isn't to God, it's to the body. And this is a very, very deep thing, because we don't only say that the lower levels of the neshama, the naran, the nefesh, ruach, neshama, is beslapshus in the guf, and behispoilus, ubeshinoi, ubesarvos. But even the chaya, and even the yechida, and you should try to say also, even the nitzutz beira, even the nitzutz of yochid, the nature of their creation is that they're loyal to the body, and what happens in the body happens in the soul. And therefore the soul, even on the highest levels, the most remote levels, the levels of the soul that are really not at all available to the body, not at all revealed in the body, there is his spoilers and there is his shtanas, and there is his arvas. Because that's how the neshama was created. The neshama was created to be loyal to the guf. Elokus was created, or more precisely, emanated, to be loyal to its source. And in its loyalty to its source, there's no spoilers, there's no shinui, and there's no arvas. As opposed to the guf, that the way it was created is there is his spoilers, there is shinui, and there is his arvas. Aval ha'oyer alaki, as opposed to godliness, hamachayu, mahava, that gives life and gives creation to the world, einim ispol ve'einim ishtan. There's no reaction, there's no change because of the interface cloud at all. Period. End of conversation. Now comes the question. But the fact is, we do say that when oyer comes into the world, it is changed through its hislapshus, through its manifestation. We find that godliness comes into the lower worlds, and because of the nature of the lower worlds, the godliness itself is changed. So the Rebbe answers, that is not in the light, it's in the life. And in the life itself is that aspect of life which is the madrega of koyach. There's 3 madregas, chayes, and koyach. So oir is b'li ishtanas, or b'li espos, b'li ishtanas. Chayes, in as much as in chayes is included, koyach is b'hispoilus or b'hishtanas. There's really only one thing, Ein Sof. But in the relation to Ein Sof in the world, Ein Sof sort of splits. To the extent that there can be something called chayes, and to the extent there can be something called koyach. So where oyer splits from chayes, even chayes, it seems is b'li hispoilus or b'li hishtanos. But the way oyer splits from chayes and chayes splits from koyach, here we say there is hishtanos and there is hispoilus. Which means the following. There's one light, there's one godliness. And if you would see how the godliness sees itself on the godly light level, you would see that it's always b'li hispoilus and always b'li hishtanos. But because within the air there is a possibility for various levels, and as the air is revealed, the air qualitatively splits apart until the level of air which is called koyach is beslapshus in the lower 3 worlds. When the level of koyach separates from the level of chayes, which separates the level of air, to come into the lowest worlds, in the level of koyach, which is in the level of chayes, which is the madrega of koyach, that it has partially separated from madrega of oyer, there is a spoilus and ishtanos. And you need to understand that there's a duality here. There's 2 sides to this coin. There's a dichotomy. Because oyer always remains the same. And if oyer always remains the same, oyer never has his spoilus and never has shinui. But oyer's relationship with the world allows the world to perceive a change in oyer. Oyer is save of kalam. Chayes is mamal kalam. And koyach is koyach, it's energy. It's not even chayes, it's even a lower level. So from the oir's perspective, the chayes that is included in oir, and even the koyach that is included in oir, retain the same laws of beli hispoilus and beli hishtanos. But that very same oir, that from oir's perspective, that the chayes is one with the oir, and the koyach aspect of the oir remains one with the oir, it's beli hispoilus, beli hishtanos, as we perceive the koyach aspect of the oir, which is separated out from the chayes aspect of the oir, which is separated out from the oir aspect of the oir, we see a shinui. So there's a duality. There's two sides to a coin which are mamish opposites. That the elokus, even the madreg of koyach, remains one with the oid, and as long as it remains one with the oid, it's bli yishtanos, bli yispaz, bli yishtanos. But from the perspective of oilamis, as we perceive the lesser light which has emerged from the greater light, or what we like to call the oid of the keli, right? The difference between oid and chayes and koyach is that oid is mein amoir. And koyach means it's taken on the flavor of the kelim. So oid, which is ein seif, which is pashut, goes into a keli, and it emerges from that keli with a gavin from a color. So to the perspective of the oid, the gavin is not really a shinui. But from the perspective of the makabel of that keli, the oid has a color. We're going to call that koyach. There could be a shinui. But you must understand that that koyach, which comes through the keli, and it comes on begavanakli, it's changed by the going through the prism. And it has the gavin as the color, as the form, the specific form of that particular keli, which is called koyach, and it can be changed when it is further mislabish in a second keli. To the oid, it never really separated out. So therefore, to the oid, there is still, even in the koyach aspect within the oid, and the chayes part within the oid, there's still b'li yispas, b'li yishtanos. So it's mamish two perspectives in the same thing, two different perspectives in the same thing, two opposite perspectives in the same thing. Godliness perceives itself as ein seif b'yatzim, can't get to its source, and it's ein seif b'yatzim, it's b'li yispas, b'li yishtanos, b'li yisarvas, as I said earlier. And even when the oid comes into elamis, kama kadishin inun lin kadosh ka'avaya, and even the way it comes into b'riyah, and into Yetzirah, and to Asiyah, where there is a separating out of Eir, the Madreg of Koyach, only to those creations who perceive the division of Eir, that there's a separation out of Chayas from the Eir, and Koyach from the Chayas, that the Hispoilus and the Ishtanus and the Sarvas are real. But to the Alakus, even the lowest world, is still Eir and safe, it's still Poshet, it's B'li Sarvas, B'li Ishtanus, B'li Hispoilus, B'li Ishtanus, B'li Sarvas. It's a very edel concept to understand, but it's also very important. So there is an idea that godliness reaches worldliness and the godliness responds. When the world cries, godliness cries. When the world hurts, godliness hurts. When the world is happy, godliness is happy. But it's the madreg of oid that comes through the keli, and it's mishtane, and it becomes chayus shebebechinas keach. But appreciate that to oid ain't safe, it's still the same oid ain't safe. It's only to the world that this division, like a tzimtzum shalei kapshuta kind of idea, in a more local way. Just like Tzimtzum Marishan is the Siluk Lav, the Siluk is Shalei Kipshutei. So in Ishtashlus, the separating out from Chayes from Eir and Keach from Chayes is only to the world and not to Lakus. To Lakus is still the same. And since to Lakus is still the same, to Lakus is B'li Yispoilus, B'li Yishtanos, and B'li Yisarvus. And to the world, the Madreg of Eir, which is called Koyach, can have a change. The Yadua, and it's known, the Chayes, the level of life, and I'm going to use a bad word, or light, which we call koyach, energy, or a tool, chumia kelim, doesn't begin until kelim. In other words, oir by itself doesn't allow for koyach. Only oir through keli allows for koyach. But even when oir goes through keli and allows for koyach, it's only to the world. It's like you seeing and I seeing blue light coming through a glass, and you're insisting that the light has not really changed. It's just the perception has changed. And so that's how it is in Nimshal Lamayla. So the kelim of b'yah, the kelim b'yah, and the exclusion seems to be even the kelim of Atzilus. That even the kelim of Atzilus do not allow for this kind of separating out of koyach, only the kelim of b'yah. And because the kelim of b'yah are mitzias, they allow for the separating out of the different aspects within Eir Chayes from Eir and Koyach from Chayes. So from the point of view where you experience, or I experience, we experience, the oil of koyach is separate from the oil of chayes, and the oil of oil, there's a hispoilus. Godness does respond to the world in a way which is similar to the neshama responding to the guf. Says in Tanya, and the beginning of the kelim debiyah, as and nefesh ruach. Since the kelim are separate from the Eibishter in their own perception, the effect that they have in oil is to separate them from what's called ein seif b'yatzim. And when the Eir is separated from the idea of Ein Seif V'Yetzim, and it becomes B'Shina Mahus, that it becomes Koyach, there could be a hispoilus godliness on the level of Koyach does react and is changed and is interwoven in the creation. Ava ba'Eir, it ain't safe. Hamachaya, which gives life, the way godliness gives life, Ein Beishum Shina V'Hispoilus Cloud, there's no change and there's no reaction. Notice here he reverses it. Here he says Shina before Hispoilus. Until now, he's been very careful to say the word hispoilus before the word shina, and I'm sure this has meaning, but I don't know what it is. Like I said, if I was writing this Mamer, I would add a couple more lines from the original text to account for the third point about B'lias Arvos and in Kadosh Ka'avaya, but who's asking me? And this is the second point of Perek Yudalet, that godliness is everywhere, but godliness being everywhere is in a kind of way that you can't touch it. You can't make it dirty. You can't make it react, you can't change it, and it doesn't intermingle, doesn't get personally involved with the creation. It's always the same. It's almost like the ultimate stoicism is Ein Seif. And it's not a coldness or disinterest, it's a distance. It's an atzmiistic distance. It's a distance called Ein Seif V'Yetzim. And from that place there can be incredible tenderness, but it'll always be B'lias Spoilers, B'lias Shini, B'lias Savas. It'll only be from the point of view of Keach HaKal Yochel, to relate to the world. And these are the words of the Frierdiker Rebbe, which the Rebbe is now going to be studying. For Inyan Bazeh, I would like to explain this. And when the Rebbe says these two words, Inyan Bazeh, Bepashtus, what he's trying to say is, I want to explain what it means. That Ein Seif is mislabish, Ein Seif lamata mata dein tachlis, and it's an eifn of B'lias Spoilers, B'lias Shin, and B'lias Arvos. But immediately the Rebbe starts talking about Kelim. And you scratch your head and you wonder, why would the Rebbe talk about Kelim if he's talking about Oyer? Perhaps he wants to talk about the difference between Kelim of Atzilus and Kelim of Yad, that even in Kelim of Yad there could be Koyach. Mashiach Kelim of Atzilus cannot have Koyach. That's one way of understanding this Perek, Vov. Alternatively, he wants to explain Koyach, Kelim, and use them as a Kolshkem V'Kal V'Chemet. If Kelim of Atzilus are B'lias Spoilus, B'lias Shinin, B'lias Arvos, Alachas Kama V'Kama Oyer of Atzilus is B'lias Spoilus, B'lias Shtanos, and B'lias Arvos. That's how I learned it. I learned it the second way, not the first way. I learned it that the reason he gives the mashal of Kelim, the whole Perek, to talk about Kelim, is to set up a kol shem kavachemet. If Kelim of Atzilus are B'lias Spoilus, Hishtanos, and his Arvos alachas kama v'kama oyer. But the other idea may be true as well. That since Koyach bezin Kelim of Yah, he wants to talk about Kelim of Atzilus, that there can't be Koyach. The Oyer does not separate from the Chayes. The Chayes does not separate out from the Oyer, and the Koyach does not separate from the Chayes within the Oyer, where it is in Atzilus. So therefore Atzilus is a B'li Shinuyim, not just in Oyer, but also in Kelim. And I don't know. But he immediately goes into K'vishabar Tzemach Tzedek Baruch of Drush Shitas, the famous Eskers in Tzemach Tzedek, which used to be printed in what is called Derech Motzesach Chelik Sheni. My brother has a copy of it. They never reprinted it because Derech Motzesach Chelik Rishon is a Sefer HaMitzvah of Tzemach Tzedek. The Motzesach Chelik Sheni is a bunch of my modem chunked together that the Reb Chaim Elazar Bichovsky printed as Derech Motzesach Chelik Sheni because it helped him with the censorship, but it's not at all Derech Motzesach. So the Maimon from that Kerach were then printed in Eratera, and the Derech Motzesach Chelik Sheni was never reprinted by Kahos. And you have this famous Maimon called the Drush Gimel Shitas, the three Shitas. And the three Shitas are about Atzilus. Three Shitas are about Atzilus. And it's very basically the way the three Shitas, the first Shita is the Shita of the Ramar, the Menachem Kanti. And this Shita, and this is the Maralmi Prague that you have in Perek Gimel Dal, the Shesh Mitzvah Tefillah in Taka the Derech Motzesach Chelik Rishon. The Atzilus is almost like a Nivra. Atzilus is separate. Siras are separate. The second Shita, which is called the Shita Menachas Alakus, I looked at the Eratera, he calls it the Shita of Reb David. In the Sefer, I think it's the Radbaz, and the Tzemach Tzedek himself writes, doesn't know where it is in the Radbaz, I think it's the Mareches, that they hold that the Siras of Atzilus really ain't safe itself. Meaning, the first two Shitas either make Atzilus much lower than the way we understand Atzilus, that Shitas Haramar, or they make Atzilus much higher than we understand Atzilus. And the third Shita is basically our Shita, the Shitas Apardet, the Shitas Arizal, sort of a mix. It's a little bit like this and a little bit like this. So when the Rebbe want to talk about Ein Seif, Lamata Dein Tachlis, and at the same time it's B'lias Spoilus and B'lias Shinui, and B'lias Arvos, of the three Shitas, the best one to bring is Shita Shniya. Notice he mentions B'Shita Shniya. Because the second shita almost sees the kelim of the Eretz of Atzilus as if they're kesed. They don't really exist. It's just that there's a reaction from them as if they were spheres. And of course, Tzemach Tzedek brings each shita. It's based on one of the sharim of the Pardes. The entire Drush Gimel Shitas is, I think it's copied from the Shar Zayin of the Pardes, at least in parts, excerpts. And the Tzemach Tzedek wrote notes on it. And of course, the end is the Shita Shlishi. This is our Shita, the Shita of Chassidus that explains Atzilus, so to speak, in a balanced way. But the second Shita is describing Atzilus as if it's still part of Maitzil, as if it doesn't really exist as Spheres. Almost like Shita Zarambam, right? Almost the Shita of the Chaykirim who say that by the Eibush there's no Pa'ul, there's no Kelim, there's just the Pa'il and the Nifl. There's the doer and then there's the effect of the actions, but there's no tools, there's no Mides, or Tayyarib, as it's called in the classic language of Hasidus. So if you want to describe Atzilus as being unaffected and unchanged and unentangled with the world of the three Shitas, and that Mamer, the Shita which is going to represent at the back, the best is going to be the Shita Hashniya. And of course, the thing that's so fascinating about it is that we know from Yosef Kedesh Timin Chav Zayin, which is a Zoyar. I'm sorry, Yosef Kedesh Chavav, which is a Zoyar, that says less Taman lo Kasha v'le Machlekes. In Kabbalah, they give the arguments, and here it's Shita Shli Gimel Shitas. That sounds like an argument. So what you learn in the Maimorim is that we take the best of the first Shita, which makes Atzilus very much into a Metzias, the best of the second Shita, which makes Atzilus no Metzias at all, and the best of the third Shita, that Atzilus has a certain depth which makes it real in terms of fulfilling the divine purpose of creation, and join them together. So one Maimer, when it wants to focus the Metzias of Atzilus, will bring Ois from Shitas Haramar and fine-tune it to conform to Chassidus the Shita. Another Mamer, which wants to speak about the abstract nature of Atzilus, the lack of form, lack of reality, will bring the Shita Shniya and fine-tune it to conform to the Shita of Chassidus, and so on. So the fact that all of the three Shitas, the Rebbe bring Shita Shniya, is because the Shita Shniya almost doesn't see Atzilus as a reality. It sees Atzilus as the Eibishter is one, and he does different things. When he does these different things, we call them by the name Sfiris, as if their Sfiris exist. And you'll see on the next page Kuf Zayin, a little bit more than halfway down the page, you have Masha Chutzavenu Mikol Shkei Midas HaRambam. And in footnote 99, I added to look into Eira Teira in Yonim page Ha'er Hey Ayin Reish, where the Tzemach Tzedek says the same words. Let me read it to you. Let me read it to you inside. Ube'emes Shita Zu Lo Yirachek Kol Kach Dol HaRambam Omer Be'etzem HaBeidi Yisbarach B'chinas Chacham U'Eidei Yidua Hamada. That this sheet is almost like the Rambam, because the Rambam is a Chayker. And the Chayker don't believe in Sfira. They believe Nachtas Pshuta. They just say that Hashem isn't lacking anything. So it's not that he has Chacham, it's not lacking Chacham. Not that he has Chesed, not lacking Chesed. Hu'eidei Yidua Hamada. It's Mamer Atzilus. This Shita is describing Atzilus in a way which is quite close to the Rambam Shita. It can't be the Rambam Shita, because with the Rambam Shita it wouldn't be Kabbalah, it would be Chakira, right? And this is Kabbalah, and Kabbalah, the very foundation of Kabbalah. You open up the Sefer Yetzirah and read the first Mishnah. Eses Sfiris Belima. The Sefer Yetzirah begins with Eses Sfiris, and the Chakim go crazy from it, right? The Rambam doesn't believe that there's form. There's just Pshitos, and there's simply no Chesaron. In the Eibush there's Pshitos. But the Tzemach Tzedek says that it's Korei Vodas HaRambam, because this middle Shita is describing Atzilus is so abstract that it's basically saying it doesn't exist at all. So when you want to describe the B'li Spoilos and the B'li Shinui and the B'li Arvas of Atzilus, you would quote this Shita. And again, this is not our Shita. Our Shita is the third Shita. Why would you go to the second Shita? And the answer is because we hold the best of the first Shita, which is that Atzilus is the real Matthias. We hold the best of the second Shita, that Atzilus is B'li Spoilos and B'li Shin and B'li Arvas. And we hold the best of the third Shita, that Atzilus is representing Atzmos Mamish because it's Masham the Kavona. So that's why I bring the second Shita. Shafilu b'kelim Atzilus, even the vessels of Atzilus, and certainly the Eidos of Atzilus, and the Af Shenikroim b'Shem HaKelim, even though they're called vessels, which means they have form and they have definition, they have a limit. L'shayach b'mein Shoshini, you cannot say about the kelim of Atzilus is spoilers. You can't say about kelim of Atzilus Shinui, and you can't say about kelim of Atzilus is Arvas. And again, this Shita is incredibly abstract, but we agree with the Shita, we meaning Chabal and Ramak and Arizal and Chassidus, even though we go in the Shita Shlishis, not in the Shita Shniya. You know, when you learn Chassidus about Atzilus, there are contradictions in the Maimarim. One Mamer will tell you that what happens in the lower world cannot touch Atzilus at all. Another Mamer will tell you what happens in the lower world touches Atzilus, but only in the Madrega of Malchus, or Chitzenias HaMalchus, the Musk Marakvei Davaya. And the third Mamer will tell you that what happens in the lower world touches Atzilus, touches Zohar itself. Now, I don't know how to resolve these contradictions. Maybe these contradictions have to do with these Shitas, maybe not. It doesn't matter to me that much. At least not in this limud. But what's certainly true is that the approach that the Rebbe is taking here is that even though Atzilus is Esesphiris, and there's Oyer, and there's Gili, because there's Kelim, and the Kelim Azul is the Gabe the Oyer, the Oyeris of Atzilus, and the Kelim of Atzilus, and the meeting of the Gili of Eir in and through, and because of the Kelim of Atzilus in the kind of way that what happens down here doesn't touch Atzilus. Not his spoilus, not Shinui, not his Arvas. And the reason is because Atzilus is Ein Seif B'Yetzim. Ein Seif L'Mayla Ein Kes L'Mata and Tachas. Ein Seif B'Yetzim cannot have his spoilus, his Shinui, and his Arvas. And he explains the idea of Achdus in Kelim D'Atzilus B'Chlal. And B'li Shinui, and B'li his spoilus, and B'li his Arvas, as it applies in general to Kelim Atzilus, and in particular to the Shita Hashniya. I say, be it Admurim, so I be prefacing first with the Mittel, the Rebbe says in Daim Mamer Azer Pashas Vayetze, which is in the Biyuri Azer, which is L'chayrim and Morim from the Tzadishtet and Akdom, Morim from the Alter Rebbe that the Mittel Rebbe wrote. This is written both about the Zayar and about the Siddur. Shakadosh Baruch Hu Eimer, that the Eibishter says, Afilu b'monin delilei ishtamish. I will not even use my kelim, the Eibishter says. The Eibishter says, I have monin, I have kelim, and I'm not even going to use my kelim. In other words, not only am I not going to invest in the world in a way of his spoilus and shin and his arvas oid, but even kelim. Ela b'monin dilach, only in the kelim of creation. The monin, hein bechinas a kelim monin, which means shirts, garments, is kelim. Well, monin diliyim kelim d'Atzilus, my garments are kelim of Atzilus. Shenekra yemon and dili, because they're called my vessels, which is mishum d'iyuv v'chayei v'gamei echad, because the kelim are also b'lakus. Or monin dilacham kelim d'biyah, and your kelim is kelim d'biyah. So the Zayar is saying, and of course this works very well with this Shita in particular, that the kelim of Atzilus also are completely removed from any kind of involvement in creation. Now let's first state the obvious, okay? The basic point of Iyuv Agamei Echad is that kelim of Atzilus are also a lakus. But they're a lakus in a way of dvekas built-in ikeres. If you listen to me, you know the language that I use, which may be imprecise to the classic language of Chassidus to drop. I like to separate the word dvekas and the word bittul. Because the word bittul means I exist and I submit, I serve. Dvekas means I have no existence, my entire existence I represent you. So lakus is dvekas. Nevrayim are bittul. In other words, lakus are bittul b'metzias or bittul hametzias, and Nevrayim are bittul hayesh. First I'm separate and then I'm connected. So Eir Ein Seif is dvekas, and kelim are dvekas. And the proof of this is what happens when Eir goes into keli. If you put Eir Ein Seif into a keli, that's even Efshari Hayesh, which has the tiniest amount of yeshus, of Metzias, of its own self-identity. The conflict between the Eir Ein Seif and the keli would be so catastrophic that either the keli would hide the Eir completely, or the Eir would destroy the keli. They are not compatible. So how does Oyer go into Kelim of Atzilus and not destroy Kelim of Atzilus? And the answer is Kelim of Atzilus are Kelim for Oyer. What makes them Kelim for Oyer, even though they're Kelim, and Kelim have the rules of Kelim, Helam and Havdalah and Hagbolah and Ischalkus, but they're Dvekas, their entire Riyaz represent Hashem, that would then they're representing the Eibishter in a level of Medina of Hagbolah, of Gvul and Tziyur. And because of this, they're able to hold Oyer. Or to say it in different words, if you would meet Kelim Atzilus, I like to think of the Rebbe's chair as Kelim Atzilus, or the Rebbe's Stender, like the Sikha that the Rebbe gave out in Tovshin Memvov Nissen time, which was called Nissen. And in that Sikha, the Rebbe tells the story of the Friedrich Rebbe as a very little boy walking into his grandfather's office, the Rebbe Marash, and his father, the Rebbe Rashab, standing opposite the table of the Rebbe Marash, who had recently passed away, as if the Rebbe Marash was physically present. And the Rebbe in that Sikha refers to the Chafetzim of a Rebbe, to the Chafetzim of a Rebbe, as Kelim of Atzilus. Kelim of Atzilus means it's a whole reality of a Lakus. It's not bottled to Lakus, it's a representation of a Lakus. But it looks like a stender. It looks like a chair. You don't see that it's a Lakus. That's such Dvekas built in Yekeres. But when oil goes into Keli, and the Keli is able to receive the oil, and the oil is not destroying the Keli, and especially if the Keli is able to reveal the oil, it's because the Keli has its own Dvekas. The Keli is a Lakus by itself, but it's only that the Dvekas built in Yekeres. So the Alter Rebbe, the Zohar is saying, not only can the world not feel an involvement of the Eibush and the Madrega of oil, they can't even feel an involvement of the Eibush in the world on the level of Kelim. Because as the Rebbe said, and will now explain, Kelim also are beli hispoilos, and Kelim also are beli hishtanos. I'm not sure if this is true in all three shitas. It's possible that in the first shita, Kelim can have hishtanos, and Kelim can have hispoilos. But in this shita, shita shniya, which is what our Rebbe is bringing, our Mamer is bringing, because as I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, Chassidus really takes the best of all three shitas and joins them together. The first shita makes Kelim into a Metzias, it makes Eid into a Metzias. The second Kelim makes Eid and Kelim into a non-Metzias. And the third shita is our shita, which speaks about something deeper. So because of the second shita, we say even about Kelim that there's no spoilers and there's no shinui. Kelim which are limited and diverse are a lakus. And because they're lakus, I mean the classic way to put it, there's no real time, there's no real space, there's no hefsedus, there's no change over time, there's no deterioration, there's no mutual exclusivity, there's no phobia, there's no contradiction between one Metzias and another. So there is what's called Seder Zmanim and Seder Mokim, even though there's not real Zman and real Mokim. Real Zman is Shinui and hefsedus, real Mokim is everything is exclusive to everything else. And in Atzilus, there is an order of time passes, there is an order of space, there are different locations, but they're all a lakus, so the limitations of time and the limitations of space don't exist. Here we're saying much more. Not only are Kelim Atzilus above the true concept of hefsedus, which is connected to time, and phobia, that means one being pushes away another being, which is connected to space, we're saying there isn't even a spells and ishtanos. The Kelim of Atzilus are lakus in the kind of way that nothing that happens in the world moves them at all. They're lakus in a way that they're unchangeable. Absolutely unchangeable. Now the truth of the matter is, if you're going to say about Kelim of Atzilus that they're lakus, there's no man, there's no mokum, and that there isn't even hispoilos and there isn't even shinui, you can argue that there's even a question whether they exist at all. Because the very existence of Kelim is a kind of shinui, l'gabi ain't safe. So in what way do Kelim exist altogether? I'm not sure about this detail, but it's certainly part of what you have to consider, that in the Shita Ashniya, not only the Eir, but even the Keli doesn't really exist. And even in as much as it does exist, there's no Zman, there's no Mokum, there's no Espilot, and there's no Shinui. And let's continue. Your vessels means the Kelim of the lower three worlds. And the lower three worlds are Kelim where there is Zman, and there is Mokum, and there is Hispoilos, and there is Shinui. And in the language that the Rebbe mentioned before, and you're going to see it at length later, that's like the Madrega of Koyach. Because when you say Kelim of Biyah, you mean the Eir of the Mislabish in the Kelim of Biyah. The Eir which emerges from Kelim of Biyah comes from Eir Ein Seif. But from the Eir Ein Seif angle, it's Leishanisi. From the Eir Ein Seif angle, there's no Espasa nor Shinui. But in as much as through the Kelim, the Koyach aspect of the Eir emerges in a way that, at least to us, appears to be separate, does not apply by Kelim of Atzilus. And it continues to explain. So the Tovkuf Samach Beis, and the Rebbe makes reference to another Mamer, in addition to the Biyuri Azeh that he mentioned before. which the Tzemach Tzedek quotes in his Droush Gimel Shitas. That's two Marmakemes. The Droush Gimel Shitas, the beauty of Zeir in Pashas Vayetze, and then you had the V'shaftu Tafos Samach Beis, parenthesis, Habichol B'Ksav Yad Kedesh Admurim Tzoy Yemagos Tzemach Tzedek. It's a book with the manuscripts on Al-Mittel Rebbe's own hand, with the Tzemach Tzedek's notes, and you have to assume it's because it's Mamer of the Alter Rebbe. She'inyan HaKeli, who the concept of a Keli is Gevul V'Tzimtzum, limitation and diminution, which means to affect change. Kelim themselves are limited, and they're there to affect change, which is lahagbe lo tzamtzam esei, to create limitation and change in oil. And the problem is, if kelim of Atzilus are beli spoilers and beli shinoi, how could this be? So he says, to be sure, even though Atzilus has kelim, and the definition of kelim classically is gvul and tzimtzum, and if the definition of kelim classically is gvul and tzimtzum, does that not mean that the definition of kelim of Atzilus is spoilers and shinoi? So he says, l'maylo ba'Atzilus, in Atzilus itself, la yitachan leim, it's impossible to say sha'keli yagbil mamish, that the keli affects in the light, an idea of limit, which is mamish, which is actual, meaning that the keli is actually changing the light. Everything in Atzilus is in the category of elikus, and the elikus is dvekas. And dvekas means believes man, believes malkan, believes baz, believes shinoi. And accordingly, ef shalem, it's impossible to say shakelim atzmam bebechinas gvul. You cannot define the kelim of Atzilus as being limited. The chas v'shalom lemer kain be'elikus. It's impossible to say, God forbid, to say about elikus that it's limited. Now, I would argue that in the other shita, and even in the third shita, our shita, the shita shlishis, according to the way it's understood in Hemshech Hayim Beis, the kelim of Atzilus actually are limited. Like the Rebbe is going to bring in the footnote to Zayin, the famous Avedas Kedesh, that's going to say, Ein Sefer Shleimusa the Kula, Ein Sefer is whole and perfect and complete and peaceful. Kshem she'esh lekeach v'bilti bal gvul, kein yesh lekeach v'gvul, just as Ein Sefer has power in the realms of bilti gvul, it also has power in the realms of gvul. V'im I ata emer kein, if you deny Ein Sefer's association with gvul, ata mechase shleimusa, you're taking away from the shleimus of Elikus, so that Elikus, kelim of Atzilus, are actually limited. And this is qualified by the Pirkei Hecholos that says, Shir keimel sheyetze bereishis reish lamed vav elef alaf mediv voice pasois, like it says, God ladreinu v'rav keach. The Atzilus is actually limited. But that's in the other shita. In this shita, we're not saying that Atzilus is limited. We're saying that it's koyach hagavul, or whatever word we're going to use, but we're not saying that Atzilus is limited. So the Gimel Shitas understand everything about Atzilus different from one Shita to the next. But in this Shita, the Shita Hashniya, the Kelim of Atzilus can't really be Gvul, because they're Elikus. And Elikus and Gvul are mutually exclusive in this Shita. And therefore, what do we mean? That Atzilus has Kelim, and at the same time, B'marin Deli Lo Yishtamish. And at the same time, the Kelim of Atzilus are not Gvul. Ach, the answer is, in order for there to be the idea of limitation, to affect a limit in something else, which is going to show up outside the world of Atzilus, this is affected through the fact that you have Klolis, you have Atzilus in general, which is Gili of Ein Seif, both Eir is a Shina Lagabi higher than Atzilus. And of course the word Shina is a bad word in this case, right? And Sprati is a kelim d'Atzilus, and Kraim b'shei monim, the vessels of Atzilus which are called monim, which compared to Ein Seif higher than Atzilus, is a shinoi. But in this shita, there isn't shinoi, and there isn't despoilus, or there isn't despoilus, and there isn't shinoi. So when we speak about Atzilus in general, and kelim of Atzilus in particular, and we describe them as being the source of Gevul, the pshat is, aval kelim d'Atzilus asmam, the vessels of Atzilus and certain light of Atzilus are beli Gevul, without any limit. And the idea of limitation as it relates to Atzilus, or the fact that because there is an Atzilus, there's a limitation, is all outside of Atzilus. So Atzilus is the kind of being that in itself, it's not limited. And I would go further and say not only it's not limited, it's not even diverse, doesn't even have division. It's just that after Atzilus is going to be limited. And because after Atzilus is going to be limited, you're going to know in retrospect, you're going to know after the fact, that there must have been some kind of Metzias in Atzilus which allowed for the limitation which is going to come out later. And this is what you have in the Maimarim, that Atzilus was called Koyach HaGvul. In the Hemshech Hayim Beis, in the famous Perek Yud Beis, which I always refer to, the the Rebbe Rashab refutes this idea of Keach HaGvul and establishes that you have to say Gvul Mamish. But in this Shita Shniya, where Atzilus is also Maitzel, Atzilus is really one with the Eibishter. Atzilus isn't Gvul, it's only a possibility for Gvul. And the Gvul of Atzilus is only going to show itself outside of Atzilus. And the nature of the Keach HaGvul of Atzilus is very, very, very edel. And later on, when we bring that Rambam, maybe that idea will become flushed out even more, but it's going to create a lot of confusion about how we understand Atzilus in the second Shita. And he says, Vadugmalas, if you want to understand the nature of the Gevul and Atzilus, according to the Shita Shniya, where Atzilus in general, and even the Kelim, are godliness on a level of Maitzel, the one with the Eibishter, so you have to use the following Moshe, people are made in the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So by studying the function of people, you have a sense of how Lakus is. So we have the ability to write. The ability to write is a skill. It's a talent and it's a skill, which starts out in the brain, it comes out into the hand to create configurations of letters in an orderly fashion and a consistent fashion and a predictable fashion and so forth. And you write one letter at a time. The power to write, which comes from the nefesh, is in the hand. And the nimshach is actually brought forward. Al yedei his chalkos head's voice, through the division of fingers. Lichte vesachas, to produce a particular letter. Now before I write a particular letter, the power of ksiv on my hand can write any letter. But the moment I choose to write, I commit. So I've now limited what my hand is based on what I'm producing. The ability to write in general. Even as I'm writing that particular letter, I can write other letters, and I can write many letters. The power is not limited. The act that the power is manifesting is limited. The way it's limited, what's now going to emerge using the ink on the piece of parchment is one letter. So the hand's ability to write has no limitations. The actual writing is where the limitation exists. And the nimshal is. The Sfiras and Atzilus are bligvul. The bligvul means they can do anything. Anything means any kind of chesed, for example, or in a broader sense, anything means any midah. When they do a particular function, now they're limited. But the idea that when they do a particular function is limited only is going to be outside of Atzilus. But in Atzilus, they're not really limited. And he says, and he proceeds to explain that in this second shita, that the Atzilus is mamish alakus on a level of Maitzel, it makes sense to say that in the world of Atzilus there is no limitation. And again, I think the limitation first of all means what aspect of midas chesed I'm going to produce, what kind of chesed I'm going to produce, and maybe even the idea of a particular midah. Although from Atzilus will emerge, because there's an Atzilus, will emerge different midas, and because of Atzilus will emerge different expressions of each one of those midas, like it says in Sharich HaMunah, that you have the idea of chesed, and then in chesed itself you have oid and mayim. Says the Rebbe that av shalachera eich shayach ba'atzilus in shalgvul, although when Atzilus there's no concept of limitation. Even to limit what's happening outside, nevertheless you could use this mashal. As hard as it is, you can use this mashal. At the Keach HaKsiva can write anything, and yet when you write, you're writing only one thing. And in the Keach HaKsiva there's a bali gavul. The same is true of the kelim of Atzilus or a bali gavul. And what emerges from kelim Atzilus is going to be an idea of gavul. Now, in order to explain this second shita, the Rebbe says a few more lines. This can be understood to explain the idea that Atzilus does not have any gvul, and yet Atzilus is the source of gvul, can be explained based on the Shitas Harambam. That the Shitas Harambam is Hu Chachmas Yachad, Hashem and His wisdom are one. Hu Yedeya and Hu Yadua and Yadua Asmak Alechad Hashem, the knowledge and the known are all one. The knowledge and knowledge are one. So, although what emerges from the Eibishter is a limited Chachma, or Chachma specifically, although what emerges from the Eibishter is a limited Das, or Das in particular, in the Eibishter himself, there's Achdos. So if the Rambam says about this Benegel Etzma Beta, about the Eibishter himself, so according to Mekubalim, at the very least, Shayach Le'Mekaim Bes Spheres Atzilus, you can speak about the spheres of Atzilus, of being absolutely one, and yet what emerges from them is going to be many. And the many are going to emerge from the one, in a way that's going to prove and going to reflect that in the one there is already the many. You see, this comparison between the Rambam and the Shita Shniya is very, very sensitive, and I'll tell you why. I would imagine that you know that there's a broad distinction between the non-mystical theologians, the Chaykim, the Jewish philosophers, and the mystical theologians, the Mukubalim, the mystics. And I talk about it all the time, I've written about it. That there are many differences between the Shita of Chakira and the Shita of Kabbalah. And one of the big differences is this concept called Tayarim. And the Rebbe has a mind from the Basi Legani, I forgot what year it is, Yad Gimel, Yad Dalet. From the earlier years, the Rebbe has a whole Mamer based on the sugya of Tayarim. Tayarim means, can you say that Hashem is smart? Now, of course, the opposite of saying Hashem is smart is not saying that Hashem is unintelligent. The opposite of saying that Hashem is smart is that Hashem doesn't have smarts. He just has no lacks. So if he has no lacks, whatever smarts is going to give, he has. But he doesn't have it as the notion of smarts, as a distinct characteristic. He has it as smart as a part of the simplicity of the Ein Sof. In other words, can you describe Hashem as having midas, particular character traits? Does Hashem have kindness? Or is Hashem one and he does kindness? Does Hashem have the midah of gvura, of exactitude and severity? Or does Hashem sometimes act precise and exact because his simple, infinite plainness includes midas ha-gvura as well? Does Hashem have chokhmah and bina, creative and intuitive intellect, or thawar and analytical intellect as individual characteristics? Or is it simply because he's infinite and he has no lacks, he has these things as well? And really, so the class, this is the Mer Nevuchim Chelik Rishon, where the Rambam discusses this at length. I don't know, Perek, the Nuns and the Samachs, where he talks about this idea at length. And what you have from the Rambam is the following. There's 3 steps. There's Payel, Pa'ula, Nifal. Payel means the one doing the act. That means the Eibishter. Nifal means the effect that happens in the world, which is limitation. The question is on the Pa'ula. Pa'ula doesn't mean the action. Pa'ula means the tool of action. When the Eibishter gives the world chesed, is he using a midah called chesed? Or is there no chesed in the Eibishter? But when we receive something which we perceive as chesed, based on our own definition of chesed, we attribute to him the midah, even though he doesn't have that midah. When Hashem gives the world wisdom, are we going to say that he gave the world wisdom because he himself is wise? He has the tool, he has the koyach, the specific characteristic of seichel? Or is Hashem infinite and plain, and he has no lack, so whatever wisdom has, he includes. And when he gives the world an idea which we define as wisdom, based on our own definitions, we attribute wisdom to him, even though wisdom is a midah he doesn't have. It's a classic question. And the reason it's a classic question is because the Torah gives the impression that Hashem does have midas. Hashem has chokhmah, Hashem has chesed, and so on. And the problem is, if you say Hashem has midas, then it's a shaila of achdus. How could one God, an absolutely one God, have midas? It's a very complicated question. It's very difficult to answer. And the basic breakdown of this question is, this is where the philosophers and the mystical theologians part company, one of many places, where the philosophers will say, that Rambam would say, that Hashem does not have pa'ules. Hashem exists, and he does things in relation with the world which we define by particular midas, chokhmah, chesed, bina, gvura, by our own definitions, but there's no pa'ula, there's no kelim, there's no tools for those particular midas. The Mekubalim disagree with the Chaykim, and the Mekubalim say, no, Hashem has midas, Hashem has a pa'ula, but only in Atzilus, and not higher than Atzilus. Right? So one of the big ideas of Elam Atzilus is addressing the question of Hashem's names, Shemes, and addressing the question of Tayarim. When it says in the Chumash, Hashem raised up his hand, is there a concept of a hand, or is it entirely allegorical? Is it entirely dibbetetic? So the philosophers say, of course it's an allegory. Hashem doesn't have hands. He does an act which we perceive as a hand-like act, so we attribute a hand to him, even though he doesn't have any hands. And the Mekubalim said that means the Torah is inexact, the Torah is imprecise. You describe Hashem as having a hand or an eye. When he doesn't have those things, it means the Torah is not being direct. And therefore the Mekubalim say, no, he has a hand. Chesed, draya yamina. The midas of Atzilus are chesed. And the chokhmah of Atzilus is his eyes, and so forth. So there's a classic And very, very important difference between the Kabbalists and the non-Kabbalists about the question of Tayarim. Can you say about the Eibishter Chochmah and Chesed, Bina and Gevura, and Shmiya? The Mekubalim say yes, and the Chaykim say no. So when the Rambam says Hu Yedei and Hu Yedua and Hu Amada, what the Rambam is saying is Hashem has no midas. Hashem has no limitations. Hashem has no parts. We do. And when He interfaces with us and gives something to the world, which we perceive by a definition of a certain midah and a certain limitation that we have in ourselves, so we attribute to Him those midas even though He doesn't have them. But the Mekubalim disagree with the Chaykim. And the Mekubalim say, no, in Atzilus, there are midas. There is Chochmah, there is Chesed, there is a right hand, there is an eye, and an ear, and so on. What the Rebbe is saying here, and the Tzemach Tzedek said it also, I showed it to you earlier, that it's on page Reishayin Hey, Reishayin Vav in the Eratei in Yonim, where you have the Mamer of Drush Shites. That in the second Shita, the Shita Shniya, we're describing Atzilus almost like the Chaykim. And that's the Lashon Harav. In this Shita, Atzilus doesn't really exist. That's what the three Shitas are about. The first Shita, Atzilus, is very real. And I would suspect that in the first Shita, now Atzilus is real, Atzilus is Shaychat Shinui, and is spoilers, at least in the Kelim. Now the third Shita is a blend of the first two Shitas, and it goes into something much deeper. But the second Shita considers Atzilus Maitzel. So although the reason there's limitations in the lower worlds is because Atzilus comes before it, Atzilus is not really limited, and to be sure, Atzilus doesn't really exist. When the Rebbe says, the unity between Sfiras and the Eibishter is at least the degree of unity of Hu Yedei and Hu Yadua and Hu Amad Atzma, in the Rambam, it's almost saying that the unity between Atzilus and the Eibishter is that there is no Atzilus, there's only Eibishter. So then what is Atzilus? Or to say it in different words, how are the Chaykim and the Gmolim disagreeing if in the Shita Ashniya there's no Atzilus? It's very hard to ascertain, according to the Shita Ashniya, how they're different than the Chaykim. The Chaykim say there are no midas, it's just the nifal, the effect of midas. The Mekubalim insist that there are Esses Firas, they shouldn't say Yitzira, Esses Firas, Chokak, Ka, whatever, all the words that you have in the beginning of Sefer Yitzira describing the 10 spheres of Atzilus. And all three Shitas hold of this, but this Shita Shniya is describing Atzilus in a kind of way that for all intents and purposes, it's like the Rambam. So I don't know what would be the difference between this Shita Shniya and the Shita Rambam and understanding Achdus. But one thing is for sure, in this Shita Shniya, whatever Atzilus means is not limited. And I would say perhaps now it's not limited, it's not even diversified. It's one with Atzilus. It's just that from it emerges Gvul. B'mikol shekein midas harambam. That the Rambam holds Eibishter created limitation. Varai he did. Even though Hashem is infinite, from His infinity comes finitude. But there's no middle step. There's no tayarim. In the Chaykim there's no such thing as midas. The Pshitas of Elokus produces an effect which we call Chochmah. So we say He has Chochmah. The Pshitas of Elokus produces an effect which we call Chesed or Das. So we say that He has Chesed and Das, even though it's Pasha B'tachas of Shitas. The Rebbe is comparing this Shita Ashniya to Shita Rambam. So when the Rebbe Zogazuz and our Rebbe is trying to explain the idea that although in Seif Lamata Adein Tachas, godness is found everywhere and in everything, but I want you to know it's Beli his spoilers and Beli Shinui. And in order to explain it, he brings the Shita that has the most refined definition of what the Metzias of Atzilus is. Of all the three Shitas, this Shita leaves Atzilus so theoretical that you have to wonder what exactly Atzilus is in this Shita. In other words, how, according to this Shita, there is a Pa'ula, not just a Nifal and a Pa'il. And putting aside the answer to that question, this version of Atzilus, even the Kelim, because there ain't Seif B'yetzem, are not affected at all by the creation. And certainly the earth. So the Rebbe is saying that in the Shita Hashniya, Atzilus is not limited at all. And you guess you have to scratch your head and wonder what kind of Metzias is, how it is a division of 10 even, in this Shita Hashniya. But that from it emerges limitation, like the Koyach HaKsiva versus Ksiva itself. And that's going to be a mashal that when you look in the lower worlds, in Bia, what's called Manan Di Loch, the kelim of biyah, what we call koyach, where there could be a spoilus and there could be shinui, because the Eid of Atzilus was masabish in the kelim of biyah and emerged in a way of koyach, which allows for his spoilus and allows for his shinui. So you know in retrospect, you know in hindsight that there must have been kelim of Atzilus, even though kelim of Atzilus are entirely theoretical. But now the Rebbe questions it. And the question still remains. Even though we explained that Atzilus itself is not limited, and limitation is given biyah, just like the koyach haksiva and the ksiva, adayin tzarich lahavin, the question still is, eich nas in agbal manan dili. How was the kelim of Atzilus involved in that limitation? In other words, if you say that Atzilus doesn't exist, and the pshitas of Elikus emerges as gavul in the lower worlds, that's one thing. But if you say that the kelim of Atzilus create the possibility for limitation, which then shows itself in the lower world, so Atzilus is the mon and dili, the kelim of Atzilus, which are the source of the gavul. How could you say about the kelim of Atzilus that they're the source of the gavul? The bishleim ba'adam, when you're talking about a person and you say that there's a power to write and there's the actual writing, and the nimshal of this would be the olam Atzilus, which would be the power to write, and the actual writing would be ilm is biyah. So bishleim by the baya person in the afal pisha etzam nefesh ilamayim mekol agbala, the neshama by itself has no limit, and it is much the neshama by itself has no limit, has no relationship to gvul and agbala and chalkas and helam and avdallah. There's a possibility that the power to write should be limited to write one letter. In fact, because she'ever adei hayad, it's a physical body and a hand and fingers. The physical body and the physical hand and the physical fingers are all limited and all physical, and they act as mediums to transfer the koyach haksiva from the kasiva b'peil. But in the world of Atzilus, although in Atzilus there's kelim, and you could compare kelim to the yad, and that's boy says the Rebbe l'shayich le'mekin, you cannot say this shada ein leguf v'lein musaguf. Even in Atzilus, certainly in the shita shniya, the kelim of Atzilus also are not really limited. And if the kelim of Atzilus are not really limited, how are they the medium through which the Hagabala emerges? So the Eibishter do whatever he wants. He wants to create a limited world. But if you want to say that he creates a limited world, potentially b'monen dili and actually b'monen dilach, Atzilus and the kelim Atzilus set up the gavul, and the gavul emerges in the lower worlds, then there has to be some kind of a concept of gavul in the kelim of Atzilus. Based on how we're describing Atzilus here, using this classic expression, mikoshken midas arambam, then kelim Atzilus don't exist at all. If the kelim Atzilus don't exist at all, you cannot say mon and dili that the Eibish's kelim are the first step, like the koyach hagvul step, what's going to be the gvul, the lower worlds. They don't exist, so they're not contributing to the hagbala whatsoever. In other words, if you're going to compare the shita shniya's idea of Atzilus to the Rambam's idea of Atzilus, you just cancel Atzilus. There's no Atzilus. It's ain't safe. But we hold that in the shita shniya also, the shita shniya is Kabbalah, it's not Chakira, that in some way Atzilus exists, in some way Midas and Teirim exist, notwithstanding the degree of oneness between the Sfiras and Ein Seif, and therefore the Mon and Dili creates the Keach HaGavol, and the Mon and Dilach creates the Gvul B'Peil. So the Rebbe says, I don't understand what's the contribution of Mon and Dili. It's a very strange answer. The answer is Hashem can do whatever he wants. Because he's Kel Yochel. Part of Yocheles, part of Hashem's ability to do whatever he wants in his pshitos, is there should be the idea of Yochel for Gavul. V'lachein Yochel lifel inyan ha'Gabala, it's able to affect the idea of Ha'Gabala, gam l'lei ha'kelim, shemechutz l'Atzilus, even if you only have kelim d'Atzilus, and you don't have kelim of the lower worlds, there would be inyan of Ha'Gabala. And then here, in footnote Tezayin, he brings the Avoda HaKedesh. You see, the Avoda HaKedesh makes a statement that Hashem is bligvul and gvul. The question becomes, the idea that in Sefer Shleimusa the Kulak, Shem Shekeicha Biltevol, Ken Shekeicha Begvul, is that a logical statement, or is that a super logical statement? Does that make sense, or is it above logic? Now you and I learn this all over Hasidus, and we make it an assumption that in Sefer is everything, Gvul and Bligvul together, and it's logical to say that Atzilus includes Gvul. In this Shita Shniya, it isn't logical. In this Shita Shniya, there's no such thing as a Lakus and Gvul at all. If it's Elikus, it's Pshitas, even on the Madrega of Manadili, of Atzilus. So the only explanation that Rebbe could give is that it's Kel Yachal, meaning the only way to explain Atzilus in Shita Shniya is that that's Mitzakech Kel Yachal. The idea that in the Pshitas of Elikus there is somehow the idea of Gvul, which is the source of the Hagabala, which is going to appear actually in the lower worlds, is Mitzat Kel Yachal. In other words, it's something which is above understanding. Because logically, if it's Elikus, it's not Gvul, it's not Elikus. Mitzat Kel Yachal, it's possible. But in the other Shita, where you say Atzilus really exists, you don't have to say it's Kel Yachal. It's Shleimus of Ein Seif, because it's a different Shita. It's a different understanding of what Elikus is, it's a different understanding of what Atzilus is, it's a different understanding of what Kelim is, and so on. So the Rebbe is focusing specifically on the Shita Shniya, which is the most ephemeral, really, of all the Shitas in understanding Atzilus, or its understanding of Atzilus is the most ephemeral, because it sets up our ability to understand what it means, that although Ein Seif, Lamata, Mata, Dein Tachas, godliness is everywhere, but there's no Hispilus and there's no Shinui. Ein Seif is found everywhere, and it affects everything, even in the klipas that are lower than the klipas the Eibusha created. And yet nothing affects the change in it, because Elikus existence, he calls it before Ein Seif B'yetzem, and its existence is understood only in the context of Kel Yachal. And based on this idea that although Atzilus can be understood from one angle as being so theoretical that there's no such concept of Gvul in Elikus whatsoever, and the only way we can describe as Elikus having Gvul in it in order to create the Gvul outside of Atzilus is an infant Kel Yachal. Mevar and Marash, the Rebbe Marash explains, and of course, as I mentioned to you before, the Rebbe mentioned each one of the Rabbeim, and this is the mention of the Rebbe Marash, in his Havos Metzias Hara, the phenomenon of the Eibush creating evil. As the Pasuk says, Obeded Ayetz, Obeded Cheshach, Eisa Shalom, Obeded, but as it says in Siddur HaKoel, but in the Pasuk it's Ra. That Af, Avishabat Atzilus Sivlei Yigor Chara. Atzilus has no place for evil. And if you know from the Kisvei Harizal, he says that every world is Klipa. Even Atzilus has Klipa, and the Klipa Atzilus is called the Ru'umo. Filakshach Ma Ru'umo, Si, Ma, Bittel. But because Atzilus Le'Gur Chara, we say that the Klipa of Atzilus exists in the lower worlds. But in this Shita, it's much Eidele. It's even hard to understand how B'chal Atzilus exists. And yet the Pasuk says that the Eibush is Beirera. And the answer is the Kiv and Shu Yisbarach, whereas the Eibush Dimiyese Ein Seif. Yesh Be Gamke and HaKeach. The Eibush has the idea of Keach. Laho Yeru Lashpiyah, B'chinas Gvul, to radiate and to give a flow in Gvul. And part of the Pshitas HaAtzmos is how Atzmos includes itself the concept of Atzilus, how Atzmos includes the concept of Midas and Te'erim. In other words, sort of a middle step between the Pshitas of Elikus, an actual Gvul, which is called another Maimarim Keach HaGvul. And the only way to explain this middle step in this Shita is in the union of Kel Yachal, because of the idea of Keach HaGavul and the Eibush of the union of Kel Yachal, the Eibush can be a source of Ra also. In Kemiz and Nimshach Gamkin, it allows for also for the Bechina of Ubei Ra, to create evil. V'hainu Hach, and it's the same thing. The truth of the matter is the same thing. Ra and Bia B'chlal is the same thing. It's Klipa. Yamo Kol Ra is the idea of Agbala. The whole idea of evil and the idea of the lower three worlds is based on the same principle. It's the principle of Medida and Agbala and Tzimtzum, measure, limitation, and contraction. So the Rebbe Marash says that the idea that Elikus is able to create Ra is mitzad the inyan from Kel Yachal. And the inyan from Kel Yachal allows that in Elikus also there is the possibility for Gvul. So the Rebbe now concludes, we're on top of page Kuf Ches, which is number 78 if you're following my numbers. The point of all of this, I'm talking almost an hour and a half. And the point of all of this is, Sha'afilu b'kelim d'Atzilus, even the vessels of Atzilus, and of course certainly the Eidos of Atzilus. The real truth is, in this Shita Shniya, I don't know b'chal how it exists. And again, as I told you earlier, we use the best of all the Shitas. We use the Shita that says they really exist, we use the Shita that says they really don't exist, we use the Shita that they really are one with the Eibush because they're fulfilling the Eibish's kavan, and we join the best of each one of these three Shitas together, which means that Chassidus would agree that although Atzilus is a Metzias, and it's even a Gvul, not just Keach HaGvul, but a Gvul, at the same time we would say that in Atzilus there's no Hispilus and there's no Shinui. So afilu kelim the Atzilus, the vessels of Atzilus, because they're a lakus, and the lakus is a reflection of a lakah, right? In the Lashon Harav, it's a lakah. Ein seif be'etzem. The Rebbe says this in the beginning of Perek Vav, the first line of the second paragraph. Beit Kuvav Ein seif be'etzem. It's a reflection of the Eibishter. And since the Eibish is Ein seif be'etzem, Eibishter linis is Ein seif be'etzem, both in the Madrega of Eir and in the Madrega of Kelim. And Ein seif be'etzem does not allow for shinui ve'espoilus. Sharei hemanad because of the Eibishter's levushim. Ve'hein l'mal megbal, they have no limitation. The tool, the idea that limitation could exist, but the limitation only exists outside of Atzilus. But in Atzilus itself, it's believable. It's called Keach HaGavul, and according to this Mamer, it's maybe even edeler than that. Again, other Maimorim go in other Shitas, and they speak about Atzilus itself being Mugul. But in this Shita, the way we're understanding what godliness is that godliness does not allow for limitation and for form and to detail for definition at all, and therefore doesn't allow for change, doesn't allow for being affected by anything around itself. So we're making the statement that says למטה ad ein tachlis. Godliness is found everywhere, even in klipas, not only the klipas that the Eibishter creates, but even the klipas that man creates, which are even lower than that. And in all places where ein seif goes, it affects and creates. And it's not nitfas. The word doesn't touch it at all. So godliness is everywhere, and God is not touched by anything. Now, I already mentioned to you earlier that this doesn't make the Eibishter and godliness this personal, a kalta fish, an unconcerned citizen. That's not the pshat. Of course, when the Eibishter does something, he wants to do it. If he wants to do it, it's value to him. But because he's ein seif be'etzem, what we do does not matter to him the way what you do matters to another person, or what another person does matters to you, because you're similar. He's ein seif be'etzem. So nothing we do affects him because of the proximity that we have with him. There's no proximity, there's no closeness to him and us. So nothing that we do matters. But everything we do matters, except that it matters not because we're touching him and moving him and changing him, but because he chooses that what we do should be of a concern to him. And in the next 2 pages, the Rebbe explains our derech Avoda. Perek Zion, it's a very nice 2 pages. This sheet is more than an hour and a half old. I don't know. I'm recording it in pieces, more than half old. So I was planning to teach the whole Zion and the whole Ches. I cannot do that. I can't give a shir for 3 hours. So I'm going to teach Zion, and we're going to shut this down, and then the next class is going to be on Ches. And depending on how that goes, I'll probably put Ches together at the end of the Mamer. Even though Ches is really a part of this sugya, and the better way to do this is to do Vov Zion and Ches in one class, and then leave Tes for a separate class. It's a short part of the Mamer, but it's the conclusion of the Mamer, but it's just not realistic for us to do this. So we're going to have to shut this down. But I'm going to read Perek Zion. Let me preface that we're about to describe, you see by the Rebbe, we saw it by the Rebbe, you see it by the Rabbeim. By all the Rabbeim, there's this idea that you can't read them. You cannot know from the facial expressions, from their words, and certainly from their mood, what's really going on inside. It's impossible to know what a Rebbe is really thinking and feeling. A Rebbe could be very, very upset and he's smiling. A Rebbe could be very, very, very happy and he looks Ponecha Zoyefim, like you have in Parshas Vayeshev, which was last week. Because a Rebbe is so far removed that he doesn't react to us. We don't touch him, we have a relationship. But it's not a relationship where we move him and he moves us. But it doesn't work both ways. We don't move him. So by a tzaddik, it's very, very hard to read how a tzaddik takes what you say and how a tzaddik responds to what you say. Now, sometimes it is possible to read, and sometimes it's not possible to read. And I'm sure there's explanations for why. But there is this concept of not having any idea what a tzaddik thinks, because a tzaddik lives on a level of ein seif. Here, the Rebbe said, give a mashal from Yosef HaTzaddik. The Yosef HaTzaddik was involved in the world deeply. And last week's Parsha Vayeshev, and this week's Parsha, Parshas Miketz, I'm telling you where I'm holding in the recordings, which is weeks and weeks before Yitshvat, which describes Yosef HaTzaddik as being the Mishnah Lamelech and all those other things. And none of it touched him. It just didn't touch him. It's not that he was stronger than him, he was fazed by it, but he was big enough not to let it affect him. It just went over his head. There's a very big difference between a person not allowing things to get to him and a person simply not being touched by things. The former is the world matters to you, but you're not letting it change you. The latter, the world just doesn't get to you. And that's a mashal for this concept of Atzilus, at least the way it's understood in the Shita Shniya. The world does not touch him, doesn't affect it, doesn't get him to react, doesn't get him to change, because he's completely removed from it. And the concept of Gavul in this Shita, in Atzilus, is very, very, very hard to comprehend, very edel. And the mashal for this is Yosef versus his brothers. That Yosef was above the world in the kind of way that it wasn't that he was tough enough to be in the world and be a chassid. He wasn't in the world. It says someplace in one of the Rishimas of Chassidim, there's a sefer called Yisrael Neach HaGodol. The Rebbe Rashab once commented about the Yisrael Neach. Yisrael Neach was a bookkeeper by profession. He was a genius with numbers. Mamash a genius with numbers. I heard people who knew him that he was always suppressing the desire to create gematrias, because he knew that gematrias is not in derech of Chabad. And he was an accountant, but he was also a very, very big chassid. So the Rebbe Rashab said, Yisrael Neach sitzt in Buchhalterei und tracht Yechudei Allah. Yisrael Neach is sitting in the accounting office and he's thinking Yechudei Allah. He wasn't there. He did the numbers, he did them right, he was a very good accountant. But he wasn't an accountant, he was Yechudei Allah. The accounting sort of happened. It's a shtickle moshel for the madrega of Yosef HaTzadik. And the Rebbe wants to use this as a means of explaining to us a little bit this second big idea of this Perek, that although ain't safe nimtza lamata adein tachlis, but at the same time ain't safe because it's ain't safe beyetzim, even though there is an Atzilus, and Atzilus is somehow an union of Gavul or Ke'ech HaGavul, but it's one with ain't safe mamish, and therefore the world has no effect and can make no change into what Atzilus is, into what Elokus is. So the Eibishter's light is everywhere, and is influencing and creating everything, and we don't touch him back. Normally the rule is if I push you, you're pushing me. That's the Chakira way of saying the physical law of motion that says every action has equal and opposite reaction. It was said by philosophers hundreds of years before, if I'm moving you, then I'm moving myself. The Eibush is a meneh without being no. He moves the world without being moving himself, because there's no spoilers and there's no shinui. So the Rebbe gives them much of this idea they talk about Atzilus, at least in the Shita Shniya. Lei Shayach Shin, if it's positive, you can expect no change and no reaction. But Sinu Gam Ben Egel and Hagav Pale, we find it by tzaddikim in their behavioral lives. And that's the example of Yosef HaTzadik, Din Yadua, Chelik Pan Yosef Li'Shvatu. We know the difference between Yosef and his brother Rabbi Yosef. Kseba Yosef HaTzadik is written by Yovi Abai Salasas Malachte, that he came home to do his work. This is the pasuk by the story of Eshes Peitif. And Rashi brings from the Targum, Lemivdig Bekisfei Chush B'nei wanted to do an examination of the accounting. He was the bookkeeper, was in charge of the house. And then later on he becomes a vizier after sitting in jail for 13 years. He becomes so powerful that besides for the throne of Pari himself, Yosef HaTzadik is the most powerful man in the land, that nobody could move their hand and foot without his permission. Alpha became still Ahmad al Omde, he stood in his place in serving Hashem on the level of Avoda, which is the Madrega of Elam Atzilus. And again, you could explain it in two ways. One is that he's so strong that the world doesn't change him, and the other is that the world simply has no bearing on him because he's Ein Seif B'Yetzim. So he's relating to everything and nothing is relating to him. As opposed to his brothers, the Shvatim Aleim, them of Heimli, they couldn't recognize Yosef HaTzadik, which is in today's Chitas, right? Naintika Parsha. Shemitzad Ma'amodam Shalash Shvatim, the Shvatim were on a lower level. So, their Avoda, to be holy, required, Be'efin Shal Reyet saying Hayu Avadecha, that to be shepherds, which is explained in Chasidus to mean Shahayu Bezbeited, does that to be solitary, have to be alone. Outside of the bustle and hustle of the city, so that the manners of the city they should not interfere with their Avodas Hashem. And they looked at their brother and they saw him as a flake, as a fly by night, as a superficial person. Why? Because Yosef was involved in every material thing. He was Mishal Shal B'Shayrei, he was Makritz B'Yenav, he did all kinds of things that are so arguably not appropriate for a tzaddik, especially a tzaddik in Madrega of Yosef HaTzadik. What the Shvatim didn't understand, that had no bearing on who he was, and therefore in no way could recognize the kind of way that Yosef HaTzadik was doing. which was he was in that condition and circumstance. Everything happened in Egypt happened through his hand. And at the same time, he did his avodah like the words the Atzilus, and according to this sheet in particular, that there's no spoilers in the world, there's no spoilers, no shin. Didn't touch him at all. There's no reason for this is the Shvatim or the Madrega Vel Mabriya, and Yosef is Madrega Selam Atzilus like the Baruch and Teira. And therefore Yosef Atzadik's Madrega of Dvegas Nalakus was such that he didn't have to be separate from the world. He could be deeply involved in the world and still be Yosef Atzadik, because the world never got to him, because he was removed from it completely, like Atzilus is removed from the lower worlds, especially in this Shita. And that's why Yosef told his brother, Sachas Alakim Ani. Instead of Shem Alakim, Pirush. They were comparing themselves to him, or him to them, and assuming that their madreg is against Shem Alakim, and he responds by saying, Atachas Alakim Ani, am I lower than Shem Alakim, which is Malchas Atzilus. But that's not the truth. I'm higher than the name Alakim, which is Malchas Atzilus. I'm not beneath Shem Alakim as you are. In as much as Yosef was Bereg of Atzilus, thinking about worldly things, it wasn't the pshat that he was stronger than those thoughts, and he didn't let him distract him, it didn't touch him. He was involved in those things, but those things were not involved in him. He got involved in helping the country and helping the world, but the world didn't touch him at all. So in this Mamer, Atzilus is a madrega of Beli Spoilus and Beli Shinui, and the most of this is the madrega of Yosef Atzadik's Avoda. And on this base, the Rebbe explains the difference between the idea of Goliv Yadua and not the Yedea. Here's another example of the different shitas. The Yad doesn't take it in Pasuk Yo. It's contradictions between one Mamer and another. There's two levels, right? There's a level called Atidei that you know. And the meaning of Atidei means you know proactively. I mean, the minute before you didn't know and the minute after you do know. And the higher level is Golav Yadua, it's already known. So there's a level where Hashem knows in a way that you can at least philosophically say that there's a concept of before knowing and after knowing. And there's a level where everything is known, where there's no such concept as before and after, he always knew. And the Maimarim contradict themselves. What is Yedei and what is Golav Yadua? Some Maimarim will say Yedei is Malchus and Golav Yadua is Atzilus. Some Maimarim are going to say Yedei is Atzilus and Golav Yadua is Kesef. This Mamer, since this Mamer is trying to argue that Elokus is Ein Kodesh Kavaya, Elokus is not at all caught up in worldliness, and the best way to explain it is by describing Elokus in Atzilus according to the Shita Shnia. Even Atzilus is not Yedei, it's also Yedua. Atzilus does not know God in a way, does not know the world in a way that you could describe it as being proactive knowledge, that philosophically he didn't know and that he does know. He just knows by himself because it's one. The world is one with him. Like the Lashon you had on the previous page, so there we have Lashon Azal Golav Yadua of the Misham Vayoelam, that the Eibishter, the one who created the world, for him is revealed and known everything. And the fetch is the word Yadua, Daf gets automatically known. Yadua, the fun of the way the Eibishter knows is Memela. It's not that he has to find out, not that there's a process of knowing, it's self-known. It's not that his knowledge comes down into a thought, that there's before the thought and after the thought, and in the thought the knowledge is proactive. And remember, this is going on Atzilus. And in this Shita we're saying about Atzilus also the infant Golav Yadua, not Yedei. And the Rebbe explains, which is what the Rambam says, Hu Yedei, Hu Yadua. Hu Yedei, Hu Amada, and Hu Yedei, and Hu Yadua. Right? The Amada means the tool of knowledge. Yedei means the one who knows. Yadua means the known. And he's medayik that the way he knows is on a level of self-known. Not he finds out, but he always knew. We talk about the Eibishter knowing. There's two concepts. There's das tachten and das ein. There's a lower level of knowing, which is knowing on a worldly level, and das elyon, a higher level of knowing, which is knowing on a divine level. And what's the difference? Of course, if you listen to my classes, you know that we discuss at length in Hemshech Samach Test, which we're learning. Das tachten is be'efen shu hayedei. The lower knowledge is proactive. Hashem knows, he finds out, even though there's no Zman. So you cannot say there was a time that he doesn't know and then he knows. But the qualitative level of knowing, since it's in a keli of das, is knowing in the kind of way that at least philosophically there's a before and there's an after. Which is be'efen shel aslapshus, where godliness comes down into the world, to know proactively. Umitzad zed, on this level, yeshini ben kedem idea b'shas idea la'achrei idea. There's a difference even in the lakus between before he knows and while he's knowing and after he knows. As opposed to dasa and the higher knowledge of be'efen shua yadua, not that he knows, but that he's not missing anything. Whatever is to know, he knows automatically. It's known to him. Yadua l'fan of Mamela. And it's not b'b'chinas aslapshus. Now in so and in Maimorim, the difference between Yadeh and Yadua is between Atzilus and higher than Atzilus. In this Mamer, based on the Shita Shniya is the difference between lower than Atzilus and Atzilus. You have to be sure. Even the higher level of knowledge, which he knows not by knowing, because by not lacking knowledge, still, Yadua l'fan of Akel Pratis knows everything in particular. Nothing is lost, nothing is missing, nothing is insignificant, and there's certainly no mistakes. Every creation passes through in front of the Eibishter individually, specifically, even in the Madrega of Yadua. They're counted individually. Even though they're all observed in one single glance. And that there's two sides to this coin. One side of this coin is skira achas, and the other side of this coin is evim b'zeh, and both of these sides of the coin are the same coin. The Eibishter knows every creation individually on a madrega of Yadua. And that's how we explain the reconciliation between zeh achazeh and skira achas. And the Rebbe says, this is the source. The idea of Das Elyon is the source. Of Hashgacha Pratis, I'll go Prata Pratim, so at the title in the lower worlds, even though his Hashgacha is B'derech Mamela, it's passive. Even before a person thought what he's going to think, before we even thought about thinking, but we even existed to think, he knows what we're going to think. And his knowing we're going to think on the one hand is knowing specifically and precisely, and it's also part of the simplicity of how Hashem knows everything. It's known automatically, Hashem is not manifest in this Yediyah. It's rather Yadua Me'elav Mamela, he knows by itself. So in this Shita Shniya, Atzilus is Das Elyon. In this Shita Shniya, Atzilus is Golav Yadua. And the Moshe of it is Yosef HaTzadik. And it explains that although Atzilus has no shaykhs to his spoilers, no shaykhs to Shinui, because there is Ban and Dili through the Ke'ech HaKal Yachal, that we go to the lower worlds, but it's not because in him there's any kind of meaning of Mitzias and Gavul. And on this basis, Alter Rebbe answers a very interesting question. There's a question that says, the idea that Hashem is involved with us and knows everything we're thinking is Hashem knowing what we're thinking and speaking is the most ridiculous thing. And why would he get involved in Narishkeit? How could Hashem know what's happening? It's very similar to the time of the Gra. How can Hashem know what we're up to? We're up to Narishkeit. The famous story with the Mitzrayim Magid, that a Yid came to Mitzrayim Magid and said someone stole his talis and film, and the Magid told him who it was. And he told him, go to that person, accuse him of stealing your tefillin, which he's going to deny, but scream at him, insist, and he'll admit. So he went to this person denied, and they screamed at him, they shouted back and forth, finally he admitted. And then he said to him, how do you know? He said, the Maggid told me. So he ran over to the Mr. Maggid and said, how did you know that I took his tefillin? The Maggid said, I knew because I saw Baruch HaKodesh. So this Ganef says to the Mr. Maggid, that's when you do Baruch HaKodesh, you check out Ganovim. So the Maggid answered, I saw it while I was sitting in the Beis HaKisi. So how do you have Klape Shmaya, the Eibishter knowing what we call nonsense? And the answer is, that Hashem invests himself in knowing each individual thing as a separate knowledge, but Hashem is. And his ising includes everything, Yedea, Yedua, and Mada. And therefore part of his ising is knowing everything is happening as a part of his shleimus. So it doesn't mean that he's involved in Lashon Machshavas as Divrei Avai. It's the pshat that his simple existence includes any Machshavas that we're ever going to have. It's part of who he is. And it's similar to Yosef. So in Perek Vav, we explained the degree of passivity or lack of Matzias of Atzilus, that not only the Eid, but also the Kelim, not really even Gvul. It's just that Gvul emerges from them. And the only way to explain how Atzilus exists for a gvul to emerge from them, and that Atzilus should be a middle level between no Metzias of Teyadim and a full Metzias of Teyadim, is an inyan of Kel Yachol. And the mashal is Yosef HaTzadik. And now the Rebbe says, we find this all about the Ba'al Shem Tov. This, the following idea we're about to read, the Rebbe kochs in it, the Rebbe likes it, the Rebbe talks about it often. In many of the Mamer. Well, Meisiv Shama, the Rebbe Marash adds, Shamatzinu came, this idea of a Rebbe Tzadik be involved in the world in a way that is not all nitvas in the world. We find this not just by Yosef HaTzadik, we find it by Nesiya Yisrael, Gam B'Deilah Shel Acharet, the later Rebbe, and he's going to speak in a moment about the Ba'al Shem Tov. The Rebbe spoke about this many times. The Ba'al Shem Tov davened many tefillas that he should be able to answer people's questions about Yonim Gashmim, even when he's in a state of Dvekas Nalakus. He should have the ability to get involved in our narishkeit, in our pettinesses, even though he's in the highest heights of heavens. And it wasn't the pshat he's going to go away from those heights, but even over there he can be involved with us. And that idea of being over there and being involved with us is the concept of Golem Yadua. It's the concept of Yosef HaTzadik's and the world doesn't touch him at all, which is a mashal for the relationship between the Gevul, the way it is in Atzilus, Man and Dili, and the way it is in the lower worlds. Ba'al Shem Tov affected, although he was in the physical world. He personally was at the same time in the highest of worlds. The Rebbe explains, Ba'al Shem Tov will come, but feel multiple times. Anytime any person asks him any question, even a physical thing, he should be in a position to answer, even when he's be'es aliyas nishmasi, when the neshama goes up. In other words, even though that the rule is that to answer a person's question about physical things, if you put the ashal, you have to answer this particulars of the question. Moreover, Vashel, the one asking the question, you have to be in their world to appreciate them, to respond to them on their level. Nevertheless, b'shas ma'is at the same time, maybe he's standing in Yehudei law. So he's involved with a person on that person's level, a particular level of that person, and at the same time he's altogether removed from it. Because his relationship to the world is like Yadua. It's very particular, and it's very, very involved, but it's like Yadua. Mitzrayim, and the Rebbe Marash finishes. Shabbos Kedish, on Shabbos, Ba'al Shem Tov was based shish l'maylav shish echad lamata. He was 2/3 on high and 1/3 down here. During the week it was the other way around. Shlish echad l'maylav shish lamata. 1/3 was above and 2/3 was in this world. So the Rebbe says, by the virtue of the fact that even during the week he had this, even though it was in a different measure, different ratio, this fact that Ba'al Shem Tov was not disturbed by the word at all is Shabbos, not because it was special about Shabbos, but mitzad Yoni who his level. Because the Rebbe concludes that during the week also the world was not teifas muk. It's Kameir, it's the same thing as the Gabi Yosef, the world of things about the Bali Yosef HaTzadik. So Yosef HaTzadik is the first mashal, and the Golem Yadua is the second mashal, and the Ba'al Shem Tov is the third mashal. That there are some people who are involved in the world in a very precise and a very detailed way, and they're not involved at all. It's not be a spoil, it's not be shinu, because there ain't safe b'yetzim. The reason is al derech indigo that's similar to the madrega of Golem Yadua, which is in this Mamer the madrega of Atzilus. It's true by other tzaddikim as well, who are similar to the Creator, that they're involved in the world and they're able to help people, but in a way of no spoilers. He answers the person's question on the level of the person asking the question. At the same time, he doesn't react, he's not changing because he's completely removed from it. And this is the concept of Ein Kadosh Ka'avaya. That although Ein Safe Nimtza Lamata Kamei Lamayla Mamish, his presence in the lower world is b'li spoilers or b'li shinui. Now Rabbi said this shiur is about 2 hours old. It's very long. I really would have liked to teach Perek Ches, but I just can't do it. It's cruel and unusual. So I'm stopping. But you have to understand that Ches is like a hemshech to the shiur of Oven Zayim, and Tes is like a new shiur. So I'll have to see how I'm going to do it, see how long it's going to take me to teach Ches. But I'm really stopping because I just can't talk anymore. I just don't think it's fair. So just to finish the way I started, that this Perek Yud Dalet Tafshin Chov Dalet's Mamer has two big ideas. Number one, Ein Seif Nimtza Lamata Kamei L'mayla mamish. Ein tziftim l'mata. Mata adein tachas. There's no place where godliness is not. In the deepest darkness, in the greatest hell of Etzilus is present. And at the same time, it's in a kind of way that nothing can touch the Elikus. Because it's removed from the world, like the Moshe of Yosef Atzadik, the Ba'al Shem Tov and Golav Yadu. But then the Rebbe is going to add even more. It can't just be because Elikus is ein tzei b'yetzem, it has to be lefi she'eini mesarif. Or kafi she'yizbaya lekamo nem yirtzeh Hashem.